Soulful Sauna, Stories of Self-Mastery. Thank you for joining us. It is you, the viewer, that makes this podcast. Your host, Juliette Noske, and her guests are here to share stories of self-mastery, to inspire you and ignite the power of positive change on your own journey. Thank you for being with us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Soulful Sauna podcast. I'm Juliette, your host, and today I have Jacky Power with me. Jacky Power is an addiction psychologist and a poet who utilizes the power of poetry to ignite heartfelt, meaningful conversations, enriched by her extensive expertise in addiction psychology and counseling. And she helps those who have lived by the rules and don't trust, don't speak, and maybe don't feel to trust themselves and speak their truth, or maybe even hold their boundaries. Welcome, Jacky.
Thanks, Juliette.
Thanks
for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, and wonderful to connect. And to begin with, it would be really lovely to hear about maybe how you got onto this journey.
Yeah. How long have we got? Well, I mean, I have always written poetry, but I haven't always shared it. But it was writing, journaling, diary creation, all that sort of thing has always been my safe place. And I had a diary where I would write in code. And I think poetry is a bit like grown-up code. You know, we can use metaphor, we can use imagery, all sorts of different things to share what we want to share without ever feeling like it's exposed to anybody else. You know, what I write and then what you pick up and interpret from what I write, even if it's as plain as day, you know, your interpretation can be something different when it's in a poem. So I started sharing that actually with my own therapist years ago, when I had started to write more, and she had said, you know, it's really, she liked it. She said, I think you should share that with more people. And I really, you know, valued her wisdom and her view of the world. She'd helped me enormously. So I started to tentatively share it. And then with the addiction psychology thing, I mean, I've had various careers. I used to work in advertising and marketing and retail, and, you know, had a whole different career. And then I packed that in to have kids. And then I wanted to go back and retrain. And I've lived experience of loving people with addiction. And it was just something that felt really familiar to me, actually, that kind of, you know, world that addiction can create. And so I had always been really interested in psychology. So I said, well, I'm going to go back and retrain. So that's what I did.
So there's hope out there then for others who want to retrain as they rebirth, when the kids kind of leave the nest and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually retrained the week that I found out that I got onto my course to retrain. I found out I was pregnant with my youngest son. And we also had just got a puppy, so it was very chaotic. But I am a bit like that. I am a bit kind of, you know, we've only got one life, and so I want to make the most of it. I want to get the most out of it that I can. So I'm not afraid to give things a go and change, because really, like, you know, I guess what's the worst that could happen, you know? That's kind of the approach I've taken.
Yeah, my mum too, she trained as a reflexologist, and the first thing was getting a book out of the library and, you know, trying it out on us. And then going from there.
Well, because the biggest limit is the one in our head, isn't it? Is those beliefs of I can't, and I still have those. It's not like they magically disappear. You know, I can still have those limiting beliefs, but I can recognize them for what they are and decide to not believe them, right? You know, and to do something different, which is what I continue to do.
Yeah. So where did you first share your work then, or how did you first share your work?
I started a little bit on Instagram, and there was a movement called For Women Who Roar by Megan February, who's in the States, and it exploded a few years ago. She had this forum for women who wanted to write, and she had put a call out for different poems and things, and she had said that she wanted to publish one of mine, but I was so naive because I'd also put that one in for a competition. So I actually said to her, oh, actually, no, I won't put it into your publication because I put it in for a competition and I can't have it in a competition if it's been published, which was a really stupid thing to do because it didn't win the competition and I could have had one of my poems published. But as I started to share a few of them, one went into Yoga magazine, like I've got a poem called I Did a Vart in Yoga, which ended up in Yoga magazine. And then I've got another one called Homeless Bum, which I read out at the opening of a homeless charity yearly event. And there's another one called Labels that ended up in the anthology The Changemakers with a group called Drop the Disorder. So they started kind of being shared out there. And so I think I'm still finding ways to do that. But reading them out, I started a few years ago and my knees were wobbling and my voice was shaking. It wasn't something I comfortably did. But I really love performing them. So I just kept on showing up, and my legs can still get wobbly. I did an event last week and then and I was like saying to the group I was, reaching out to, my legs has decided to wobble today, so I'm gonna sit down. But I mean, I have also ended up doing sort of 2 one-woman poetry shows, which I wrote and produced and performed myself. And then I took one of those up to Edinburgh last year. So like I said, I've not let it get in the way.
Yeah. And isn't that a wonderful example? Because sometimes we may see someone who is performing and doing their one woman show, and maybe people have an image of who you are, that you've got it perfectly polished and your legs aren't wobbling and everything's all good. But
Yeah.
actually, to hear that, I'm hoping that it gives people hope out there, when they think, wow, could I actually share mine?
Well, I think exactly that. And I think the more people, in fact, my first show was called Light in Life Shadows. And it was exactly that. It was exactly saying, when do you hear from the people who are in the struggle? Like we always hear of the people that have achieved, and then they tell you the steps that they got there. But it's so much nicer because most of us are in some kind of struggle at any given time. And isn't it nice to share from that place anyway? And it's much more collaborative, and it's much sort of more typical, really, more usual, that we're all sort of struggling. So I have no fear of doing that, and that is because I've embraced those messy bits of me that aren't perfect, that once I started to kind of go, actually I quite like those bits because they take me places, right? They take me to somewhere else, those imperfect bits. So once I started doing that, it was then the masks kind of fall away, and then life gets really interesting and fun.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw with your book, it mentioned that you wrote one of your first poems when you were 11, and it was a rap song. Is that
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
rap style poem?
It was anti-drugs. Yeah, I can still remember the first verse of it. Which, yeah, I did it for a religious studies project. I think I grew up in the era of Just Say No. I mean, it's bizarre that I ended up being, working in addiction as well, that my first poem was an anti-drugs rap. But yeah, yeah. So that was fun.
Can you remember when your own self-mastery journey began? When you got onto that journey of learning and growing consciously?
I'm not sure it's actually self-mastery. I think it's like an unlearning for me. There is this constant unlearning, and that actually took a while, because I think I did initially think it was a self-mastery. So I had, you know, things, I had what I call like juggernauts happen in my life from about the age of 20, and I sought out help for them, you know, therapeutic help, and some of it, and it really only just touched the surface of what was going on for me. And I think that's when I hadn't challenged any of any of the conditioning that I had grown up with. You know, there were things that had happened to me that I felt bad about, that I felt ashamed about, that I needed a space to process. But actually diving into the messiness of the human experience, I think, happened later in my 30s. And that was, you know, that was when those juggernauts were coming thick and fast. And I didn't really have an option other than to go to really ask for help, and to kind of pull apart the everything that I believed. It was like doing a 180 flip. Like everything that I thought was right now felt like it was wrong. And so that was in my mid 30s. And I went to a trauma healing workshop in the States for a week. Workshop, like it was an intensive. And you know, we just started looking at my history and the different levels of trauma that I'd experienced and what I'd normalized. And then suddenly it was like, oh, everything actually now makes sense. So then it was an unlearning of that conditioning, and a calling back to that vulnerable, enchanted, curious, inquisitive self that was there.
And can you remember what are some of the things that you had to learn specifically, unlearn?
That idea of being a good girl, that it was important to be compliant, and that actually it wasn't that I had got the wrong end of the stick, as I had been told, or that I was too sensitive, as I'd been told, or that I just needed to stop worrying so much. That actually there was good reason for me to be anxious, and what had been normalized for me growing up was actually, I was right in feeling like it was harmful. And then for me, like a key thing was boundaries. It was because, you know, that kind of setup led me to be loyal without question and without discernment. And so I had to unlearn that, again, that compliance, that loyalty, and learn to be loyal to myself. And that's tricky because, you know, you start doing that and that upsets people that have been very comfortable with you being compliant and very comfortable with you doubting yourself. So yeah, that was very painful, but very rewarding as well.
Yes. Now, I mean, obviously, I don't know the whole of your situation, but I did do a training to do with education and how we support our children grow up. And one of the things that they looked at was, you know, this when we're like good girl, good boy, for example, and how often we say that. I really became like, after the training, I really became conscious and aware and how often we're saying that. And I realized for me, for example, one of the things that I got praised a lot for was finishing everything on my plate.
Yes, yes. And so that's food scripts, right? Then we start to have these different food scripts. And I'm trained in eating disorders. And one of the things that we look at when we're looking at someone with an eating disorder is, well, what were your food scripts? What were you, when were you welcomed into the fold, and when were you rejected by your behavior, around food specifically?
Yeah. And I did actually have bulimia later in life when I did dance as well.
Right.
Yeah, which, has a very interesting pattern there that I've observed over the years.
Yeah, and it's interesting with bulimia because the purging element of it is an addictive process. It releases, sort of dopamine, endorphins, that kind of thing that keeps us in the loop. So when dealing with bulimia, it's really important to work on the purging before the binging. You probably all know this, Juliette, but I thought that was really, I found that really interesting when I was learning about it.
Yeah, yeah. I actually didn't go to a specific psychologist or counselor for the disorder. I was able to heal it within my life. So I'm very lucky in many ways, I guess. So I didn't necessarily know what you just said then, how, that you would work with the purging first. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a eating disorders are very complex,
Mm,
and the difference between sort of bulimia and anorexia, often with anorexia, there's this idea of a voice that's very loud and punitive, and yeah, it's so to break the hold of that voice can be really difficult.
yeah, yeah. Wow. So you specifically work with eating disorders then as one of the forms of addiction?
Well, so I've trained in eating disorders. The majority of people I see, there's always disordered eating, actually, I find when you're looking at addiction, there's people don't take care of themselves very well. And so that can manifest in the way that people eat. And it's amazing just what power food can have over our well-being. Another thing that I found was fascinating was the role of protein and an amino acid called tryptophan, which helps create serotonin. But if we're not eating protein with complex carbs, then it can't sort of work properly, so that it can build up into serotonin. And serotonin is that, that lovely hormone that gives us a sense of balance and well-being and things. So, and just also how if we don't eat first thing in the mornings, we can have this thing called a starvation high, which again, endorphins get released. And so that can keep people from eating and things. So it influences our mood. Like what we eat influences our mood so much, So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. And do you have, by any chance, an interesting sauna story?
I Not a personal one that I can think of, but I do love a sauna. I was talking to an acupuncturist recently because I am not a cold water swimmer kind of a girl. Like I've tried the whole cold thing in the shower for a bit, and I know it's great for you, but I'd rather do a hard pass. But alternatively, being in a hot sauna, which she was saying, actually, some people are naturally kind of cold oriented or heat oriented, and so and I love being in hot climates and all of that sort of thing. So maybe I'll spend more time in saunas in the future, and then I'll be able to come back and say, actually, I do have a
Did you ever go in the cold plunge pool afterwards?
no. Like I said, hard pass.
Ah. And what would you say that other things that you do to pass the time, or the things that you enjoy where time seems to fly by and you love doing them and you have fun?
One of the things I absolutely love doing is just going for a walk, which I love going for a walk by myself because I'm a bit of a nerd in that I will go and really notice things that are out there. Like I might end up taking a video of an ant's nest or picture of a slug, or like I love going out and just seeing what, what, like, sounds a bit trite, but like what gifts nature's sort of providing for the day, And I've got a very old dog now, but I miss going out for walks regularly because I would have to, whereas he sort of stumbles around now. But yeah, I think that, and I'll sort of say that it's kind of where I wrote my thesis for my master's when I was out walking. I think that the actual act of walking, I think it's been shown that it really helps sort of your brain work, and the way that it helps all the different neurons fire and things. And so and it's where I write poems as well, so
Yeah. It reminds me, we had a talk recently with one of the companies that I work with, Birth of Earth, and we had someone from Derby University come in and talk about nature connectedness.
yeah.
And one of the things that she shared was about the 5 pathways, and one of those, you were a living example of that, where you were really getting curious and connecting with the specific plants and animals, and like the ant's nest, as you said. And even if we're doing that through our phones, we're getting curious, and we're really connecting with those different like elements of nature. And so that also is really good for your well-being as
But
well.
I think it's so bizarre that we talk about nature as if it's this thing outside of us, because we are nature. And so, of course, being out in the woods is our natural habitat, that's, and I think on some level, somatically, we still know that,
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
But I'm with you on that one, 'cause I'll see the wasps or the bees on the flowers, and I'll be there for hours, filming them, trying to get nice close up. Yeah,
And then it's great to put it in slow motion, and you just see this little buzzy bee, and it's, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And when you wrote your book,
Yes.
what was it like birthing that with all of those poems in there? Because I mean, I'm a creative as well. I think we're all creative beings, but I do love drawing and writing, and I find that when I put things out there, you are birthing a part of you. And I know you said that because there's, it's metaphors and things like that, you're a little bit, not separated from it, but you're not necessarily as raw as perhaps if you were speaking in exact terms of what you were expressing.
Mm.
But I think still you are birthing something from yourself. So what was that experience like?
Well, this book came out of the show that I did. So it's basically all the poems that were in the show. And it's actually my second book, as in, but it's the first one published, but it's actually the second book I wrote. So the first book I wrote is called Our Human Tricky Things, which I still haven't put out into the world. And I think that's because that would feel like a real birthing, because although it's got poetry in there, I do go into the narrative behind the poems, and it offers much more my point of view than this book does, this collection of poetry does. And this one really felt like an act of service, actually, that, it's my top 10 reasons why I want to leave the planet. But really it's a bit of a call to, I see the ways in which we are distressed. I think it was bearing witness to distress, really. So and I think a lot of what, I share in here is commonly felt, whether it's the challenges of aging or climate change, or that some people in the world, are told that they don't matter because of the color of their skin or where they come from, or the fact that they're trying to flee a country, or, whatever. They're all common things as human beings that we can understand. So, and it's an interesting question, because what happened was it got published, and then the next day we went away on holiday, and it was just the way that it happened. And so I didn't actually promote it or really make too much of a song and dance about it. And I find that with things that I do, that I'll do lots of different things, but then I don't really kind of go and promote it. But then I don't go and promote my own actual kids out on social media and things like that. So it's not really, it's not really in me to do that. So I think it's been a quiet birth, and that's been fine. That's been okay.
Yeah, yeah. I can't remember where it was I heard, but someone, it might have been in one of the many books that I have open and I'm reading at any point in time.
You know what that's like.
Yeah. And they were saying that, to create for creating, not necessarily for this kind of end product or the trumpeting at the end, where you have the celebration, but just being creative. And I think it's a huge part of it, of being human and of being,
that might be. I wonder if that's Liz Gilbert in her what's it called?
oh
Big Magic.
yes,
And I do feel that it's like, well, I've got this capacity to be able to write in this way, and really it's my job to nurture that capacity. And so I create and I put it out, and then I trust that reaches whoever it needs to reach. And I don't know, maybe that's like this kind of like underachiever, under-earner kind of approach in life, in one sense. But in another sense, that just feels right. So I trust that.
Yeah.
For right where I am and right now, and yeah.
And the underachiever, under-earner thing could just be, the voice of society and
Exactly.
what says that we should be doing or, shouldn't be doing, or.
But I had someone come up to me recently, and she was last week when I was at the poetry thing that I was reading at, and she said, "Oh, I gave my friend your poem. There's one called All at Sea, which is about hoarding, actually. It's about sort of clutter and hoarding." And she said, it really moved her to tears, because she felt like someone was really expressing what it was like for her, I mean, that's kind of priceless, that's what I want, is for people to feel seen through what I write.
Yeah.
Or through when I'm working with them in a therapeutic setting.
Wonderful. And so how do those two worlds come together then? Your therapeutic world and your writing world, and are there other parts of you as well?
Fluidly, I think, is the way I would describe it. So there's different ways. Like, I've done writing workshops. So I've done writing workshops for recovery groups, and there's a group called the Worst Girl Gang Ever, which is for people who've had premature baby loss or miscarriage and that kind of thing. So I did a workshop for them on grief, and I'm doing one for them in the new year on hope. And so I've got this group of workshops that I've done, but they're all informed psychologically. So I've got one called Protection, but actually I go through, it's basically a lesson in trauma, but it's done through sort of poetry and writing exercises and things. So I really like doing those, because I think it's almost like they're therapy for people that don't want therapy. Like, it's a therapeutic setting for people to be able to kind of self-reflect and self-witness, but to not feel too exposed. And I think the way in which I am in the world means that I think as a poet, you really notice things. I think that's what poets do, is they've got this real attunement to noticing and feeling things, and feeling that, or just expressing feelings. So I think that's what the poetic side, brings when I'm with clients. And then the psychology elements helps to inform my writing, and my writing helps to inform my psychology. I mean, all of this year I've been writing a series called Permission to Feel. So every week I've sent out a newsletter with a different feeling, and writing it has been fascinating. So I was like writing about frustration, and it was like, you realize that when we're frustrated, we go to one of three places. We either go into like what I call, you become an up your gamer, a self-shamer, or a blamer. That when we're frustrated, we either want to blame someone else or have a go at ourselves, or I need to try harder. They're the three go-tos. And that just all came to me as I was writing. And then the one that's going out this week is around anguish, but I started writing it around the Grinch, but then it was like, well, actually, what's the antidote to anguish? Well, it's love, it's self-love, it's love for others, it's the love of the universe that we receive. These are all ways that can help to sort of soothe our anguish. So what I've loved about that is through writing, it's sort of deepened my psychological insight. And each one has a poem attached to it, or that I use within what I'm writing. So it's just been really fun. Just really enjoyed it.
Are they your own poems?
Yeah.
So do you write a new poem specifically for each one?
No, do you know, it's really funny. I think I'm 100 newsletters in, and I've managed to find one that I've already written for everything that I've been writing, that I already had. I think I've written about sort of the spectrum of feeling, and have managed to, reflect that back in whatever feeling I'm writing about. It's just pretty phenomenal, really. Yeah.
Yes, and vocabulary and being able to express your emotions, I think as a humanity, we're very good at maybe going to the moon or going in a submarine underground and, technology but when it comes to the vocabulary and the expression of emotions, I think that's where we maybe need to focus.
And that's what I'm so passionate about, because I really do think we have this amazing technology inside of us, which are our feelings, our emotions. I call them macronutrients for the soul, right? They're really helping us figure out what we need, what we don't need, what we like, what we don't like. And we do ourselves a disservice by shoving them down. But the reason that we do that, I think, is twofold. One, we don't know how to process them. So we're so fearful of going there because how do I get out, the other side? And it's not role modeled by anybody. I mean, it really gets me whenever you see somebody crying on TV, that the first thing they do is say sorry. And yet when we cry, this is one of my favorite facts, when we cry, we release hormones. There's a hormone called leucine and enkephalin, which is a painkiller hormone. So it's like we're accessing an inner pharmacy that's helping to soothe us. And yet we say sorry when that happens. Like, how messed up is that? That actually, but I think people are afraid that, and you hear this, don't you? If I start crying, I'll never stop. Yeah, you will. You will. You will. But we just don't see that role modeled. Then I think laughter is very similar to tears and crying. It's another way our body expresses something that we have no words for, but we don't apologize for laughing. So I find that bizarre.
I usually have to apologize for laughing.
Is it because it's in inappropriate times, or do you laugh like a drain?
My laugh is like a scream or a screech. It can be quite loud and piercing from the other person's perspective. My grandma did say at one point, if you laugh like that, you won't have any friends, Juliette. I think, that was a bit dramatic. But yes, it is a loud laugh, but I've come to embody it and embrace it, and
Yes. A
love
good
it.
belly laugh. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, it's interesting. What was that thing that is released when you cry, the painkiller?
Leucine and kephalin. So the reason I found out about that is because someone was talking to me about crying tears of grief, and they said my tears taste different when I cry tears of grief. They'd lost their partner, and I thought that's really bizarre. So I looked it up, and that's when I found out that actually when we cry tears of grief or tears of joy, they are a different kind of tear to the tears we cry when we say we're cutting an onion. And then I looked into, there's these amazing magnified pictures of different tears. And tears of joy are like big bubbles, and tears of like pain and grief have really sharp edges to them. And this is seen under a microscope. It's like, that's just amazing.
Yeah, that reminds me of the Japanese gentleman who did the experiment with water. And
Yes. Did
yeah.
he say different words around it or something? Is that
Mm,
right? Ah.
yes. Yeah. And yeah, the ones that were love, joy, peace, the water was very different from the ones that said hate and pain. And yeah, that's fascinating.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
I'll have to check out those images of the tears, definitely.
Yeah. But it all comes back to this unlayering, right? This unlearning, this inner wisdom that we have when we're in and around nature, because we are nature, the inner wisdom that we have if we just let our body express what it needs to express. I mean, when we're talking about trauma, that's basically what we're talking about, is something's happened within us that we haven't been able to fully metabolize. And so we're still holding it, we're still carrying it. So you're actually doing humanity a service by having a good old ugly face cry. That was what I would say.
Yeah, my mum used to always say that the souls, the tears water the soul and create rainbows.
Oh, yes, that's lovely.
Yeah. So, are there any tips that you would like to share with people out there on their journey of unlearning?
I think get really comfortable with the bits you want to shove away. I a few years ago I went to a literary festival with some short stories that I'd written, on the hunt for an agent. When I was really ill prepared, I just, I went on a punt basically, and like, see how this goes. And sure enough, they were like, no thanks. And I kind of came away feeling a bit all, fed up and self-piteous. And so I really indulged that part. I wrote a poem called Bitterness, and and I just like, I wrote this sort of I'm trying to think of the name of the Anne Lamott. She calls it the shitty first draft, where you just write out everything, just let it all out. And I just wrote and let it all out. And then I sort of had a look at it, and it's like, and the poem is really me having a laugh at myself, because it's like, yeah, I get it, all you people over there who did so brilliant. Well, I didn't want a book deal anyway, it's kind of but by allowing that mess, and allowing the envy and the bitterness and the self-pity and the judgment and all of this stuff, like it doesn't last very long. And it was then that I could turn around and look at that and go, well, actually, what was good out of it? Well, actually, those agents did know what they were talking about, and they did offer some feedback. And this has helped me to question how I really want to show up in the world through my writing. Is it short stories for children? Well, no, it's not. It's actually poems, because I've just written a poem on this experience, And so I think one of the things that I hear so often with my clients is, I shouldn't feel. I feel angry, but I shouldn't. I feel annoyed, but I shouldn't. I feel jealous, but I shouldn't. But that's how you feel. Select yourself, and then what's it trying to tell you? You know, I think that if you're feeling envy or jealousy, there's a sense of deprivation in there. Well, what do you feel deprived of then? It's just, if we're unafraid of our feelings, we can open ourselves up to a much richer life.
Mm. And the quality of the questions that you ask then as well, you know, rather than saying, oh, I shouldn't be, how can I get over this? You know, it's okay, so what's this teaching me?
Yes,
Mm.
yes. Make friends with all of those feelings that we've been conditioned by society to not feel in order to comply and to be a good girl, right? Well, actually, what if I do? And is that sort of like shadow work, really, isn't it? Well, what if I do make friends with that part of me? What's it there trying to say?
Yeah. I think it would be good to journal maybe about all the different questions that you could ask yourself and look at how those questions can direct you into an open, learning, growing space. I think that some people, they don't have experience of what kind of questions they could ask themselves, maybe.
Well, I think you could just have a conversation with it. So, you know, when like, you know, if you take that example with the agent, what were you hoping for? What would that have meant if you'd got that? And what is it about that would have been so wonderful? And is it possible that you can still have that feeling in a different way? You know, and just, so I think just imagine that feeling is like a person sitting in front of you talking to you, and have a conversation with it and just get curious, rather than shutting it down and saying you've no place here. Invite it in and have a conversation.
I love that.
I mean, it can be great fun. You can have a whole party with all your different feelings. Bring them all in.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're not necessarily feeling one feeling separately at a time, are you?
No, we never are. And that's what I wrote about last week, about the paradox of feelings. Like, yeah, if we're feeling grief, then there's probably some love in there somewhere. If we're feeling anger, then there's probably hurt and disappointment, you know. Yeah, it's never linear, I don't think.
Wonderful. The magical world of feelings.
Yes. Yeah.
So is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before we end our wonderful conversation?
Can I share a poem?
Please.
Should I
Please.
share? I might share that one that the woman mentioned the other day, because it's called All at Sea. And it kind of, I've got to find it now. It kind of talks to that idea of, you know, metaphor and yeah, and just being able to reframe the way we look at things, which I think is what I'm always trying to do in poetry. So the background of this poem is that my friend who's a declutterer asked me, did I have a poem on decluttering? I said, no, but I'll write you one. So I wrote this, and it was really this idea that when people find it hard to throw things away, then there's a story behind that. So that was where I started. So it's called All at Sea. The papers you poke at are not, in fact, a random pile, but a telescope where I can look for miles back to the things I may have missed when I mattered more, was less dismissed. And that broken teapot is not, in fact, random tat, but it takes me back to my first flat, with my only love when we laughed and laughed, my teapot memory life raft. And the fridge magnets and knickknacks there are not, in fact, random clutter, but memories that unfurl and flutter if I were to hold them in my hand like lost treasure dug from within the sand. The piles of books in every corner are not, in fact, a random selection, but a faithful rudder aiding my direction, their words coordinates to steer me on, if I just had time to open one. All this that you say must go is not, in fact, what's at stake, but like a boat creates a wake, the consequence of my truth within, that I'm afraid that I can't swim.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. That's wonderful.
You're welcome.
Well, Jacky, it has been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you to Matt and Ken at Thermalux UK for offering their saunas as a space for me to record my podcast in. Soulful Saunas, stories of self-mastery.